Why, hello, and welcome to session 2 of our wonderful summer course that you're all taking. I hope that you enjoyed week 1 and are feeling more comfortable with Canvas and all of the navigation and figuring things out. Usually that's the big thing in the very beginning of a course that you're taking online. So here we are at session 2. Some of the big ideas and things that we will be discussing. We're going to look at, and I'm going to ask you to make a prediction. What do you think are the predictors of learning to read? If you work with younger children, I'm sure that you probably are more cognizant of this in figuring out those predictors and students and children of what is important in learning to read. And then do you do student watching? There are a couple ideas in Words Their Way, and I highlighted a few on our mini lectures, in the mini lectures, and in our PowerPoint about some ideas to consider in watching and looking and observing your students. And then lastly, what I wanted to share with you was just a brief overview of your wiki group work that you will be doing with looking at and researching, reading, learning all about phonics and phonemic awareness. Some of you may know a lot about it. Some of you may have no clue or you don't remember, depending on how far you are removed from working on your master's or your recertification or taking reading courses. Certainly in all the reading courses, we address phonics and phonemic awareness at some point. It certainly is an integral process or component of the process of reading. So that is just a little bit of the direction in which we're going this week for session 2. One thing I wanted to address is your discussion. Don't forget that you do want to be professional. It is worth 20 points each week. So you need to consider that. And I've given you bullets. They'll change from week to week depending on your course activity. Normally your course activity, you're going to be doing either highlighting points and responding to points from your from the PowerPoint that you're watching and from your reading and your text. So this week it's a little bit of a combination because your wiki is completely a research project with the two different components of reading. So just take note of the areas and the bullets which I ask you to address specifically, and keep in mind that I'm not expecting pages and pages for your discussion, but I'm thinking that your discussion, your initial discussion that is due on Saturdays, is about 1 to 2 pages if we did it as a paper. Certainly you're doing it in the discussion forum in that format, so it looks a little bit different and it's single spaced. So just think about that. And then your response is not just oh yeah, Maria, I loved what you said about this, or Susan, I really agree with that. You really need to give some information. Again, that's half of your discussion point. So you want to make sure you address 2 by Sunday evening, and that you give either more information, ask questions, share some ideas in respect to what you are reading from one of your colleagues. So these are the discussion points for this week that I'm asking you to specifically address, and then you can do connections and questions and all those other suggestions or things that you would like to write about in your discussion. Okay, and so when we think about how our students learn to read, I always think, how did I learn to read? And I know that when I was younger, one of the big things in education was that move away from phonics. And so I was never directly taught phonics. And certainly as the last 20 years of my career, when I was writing books about reading and I was working as a reading specialist and literacy leader with students and with teachers and teaching adult courses of reading, I've certainly had to go back and look at phonics and the role that it plays with students, because it didn't play as big of a role in my life. I learned to read a little bit differently, but most students, many students, I shouldn't say most, many students, phonics is an integral component. But think about how you learned to read, and is that very influential in your teaching today and what you choose to teach and how you teach? And then in thinking about programs and materials and books, etc., is that also things that you had as a child when you were learning to read. So keep that in mind as teachers, that sometimes we have to move away from all the things that we were important in our learning to read and move toward our students today. Our text says that students learn their own way, and that's why it's called Words Their Way. So when you think about your students and they're learning of phonics and spelling and vocabulary, it truly is based on their developmental level or stage where they are. And sometimes we can't understand why they can't figure out another piece of phonics or the spelling or vocabulary, and it's just not at their level at that point, or their instructional level. So that's why it's so important to determine those levels and to know where your students are, and then to work with them starting there, moving them to where they should be. And then also, secondly, in Words Their Way, they talked about the fact that students' learning is based on the way they are naturally inclined to learn. And the natural way that we learn is with patterns, and it's through comparing and contrasting word features and looking at and discovering those consistencies and those patterns. And so that's why that's so important in thinking about our students and how they learn. And then as you observe students and you are watching, and I know that some schools are very into taking anecdotal notes. I know that instructional facilitators sometimes will ask, or principals will ask, well, how do you know that? Well, if you have your little sheet that you've been recording through the weeks of teaching when students are writing and reading, then you can validate that. So observations and writing, those are a couple just things to keep in mind. Certainly they help to reveal what the students understand about words. They help you to determine not only their orthographic knowledge, but also some of their habits that they have and some of their dispositions in writing. And then spelling certainly is that conservative measure of what students know about words. So keep that in mind. It's a conservative measure. It isn't the all-inclusive, and that just because a student can't spell well, if you've read Richard Gentry, you'll know some of these points, but that doesn't mean that the student isn't smart, isn't a good reader. It is a conservative measure. Keep that in mind. And then as you watch your students in reading, and many of you have done benchmarks or running records, that type of thing. And so we think about the words and that they can be recognized with many types of textual supports. So when your students are reading, is that something you've noticed? Those reading errors, certainly when I've been doing the last couple weeks, running records, Fontes and Pinnell, as I say, the F and P, reading errors really do show us what students are using, what they're not using, what they're confused about. Are they using that beginning sound? Are they having a hard time with the medial sound as they're reading? Do they not even look at the word? Are they making meaning from their text? Do they use the grammatical, as they're reading, and think about that and keeping that in mind? Or are they really reading for meaning? Are they thinking about what they read and it makes sense or it doesn't make sense? Do they stop and look at you? Sometimes I've even written the notes on my Fontes and Pinnell, and they say, this doesn't make sense. I don't know. Why did the author write that? Those types of things, which is funny. And then the last note is a response to reading errors depends on knowing where your students are developmentally. So those are certainly parts that we do a lot with writing, and you may have your writing benchmarks and your reading running records that give you more information as you student watch. But then what do you see every day as students are reading, as they're reading with partners, reading in a small group, reading in a whole group? Those are things too you can note about your students. I don't know if you have ever used Starfall, but there are lots of great decodable texts. Not my favorite text, I'm going to be perfectly honest with you, but they are really strategic in working with my kindergarten and first grade readers who are not do not know all of their letters, or don't have a strong base or foundation in phonics or phonemic awareness. And so an example on the right side is the decodable text. We see the seeds, we see the sun, we see the rain, we see the weeds, that type of thing, that is just kind of almost a sing-song type of reading. Can't, not a lot of meat to it, can't do a lot of deep comprehension thinking, but it's helping the students to learn their phonics. But Starfall is one of my favorites that I've used, that has lots of great books, and certainly has the decodable text that you can use. All right, I'm trying to get there. I'm going to pause this a second and get to our site. The site, one of the Starfall sites that I had, and I chose the Learn to Read. And when you click on the book, it used to be they gave these away, and as a reading specialist, I used to get them and give these beautiful colored books to my children. Here's the short A. And you can download these as a book, is when I do and use these in kindergarten when we're doing short A. So you can see cute books. These are great websites to share with parents, to utilize in maybe an intervention station that you have, or with your students in a center. So just a couple ideas and things for our session 2. Thank you very much, and have a great week. Happy learning.